Awesome. Thank you so much, Elisa. Thank you so much, Adele. And thank you so much, worship team, as we kick off live worship here at Faith. How's everybody doing this morning? Okay, that's mediocre. All right. Let me give you one more try about that. How's everybody doing this morning? Yeah, all right. Hey, the sun's out, right? I have a whole joke about sun here in just a second. It's ruined. God spoiled my joke, all right? He must have joke's on me. So I'm going to tell it anyway, so get ready for it. Okay, here it comes. So I hope everybody's doing good this morning. It's the last week before we lose an hour of sleep next Sunday. Daylight savings time starts next week, and some of you are saying, yay, more sun. And then I'm like, no, but sleep. Sleep's more important than sun, right? And it's Vermont. It's wintertime. The fact that we have sun today is like a minor miracle, okay? So, what are we going to get more of by adding one more time of daylight here? But at any rate, it is daylight saving time switch next week. Just make sure that you keep that in mind as you are preparing for next Sunday morning, especially with it being Faith Family Sunday, as we gather together for food and activities and a whole bunch of great stuff next Sunday as we celebrate St. Patrick's Day early together. One of my favorite people of all time is St. Patrick. I can tell that story another time, but so excited for next week. And before we get to Sleep Deprived Sunday, though, for next Sunday, today I pray we have a fully refreshed crowd ready to dive into what God has for us today. And it's extra special because we're wrapping up our current series called what? What have we been going through, church? About 10 people know. Perfect. Giants, yes. Great, giants. It's all about how we're navigating life's greatest obstacles and greatest opportunities. And we've had a little bit of everything in this series. We've had talks on calling. What is the purpose in life? What is God calling you to do? We've had discussions about combat. We had people's heads getting chopped off. It was amazing. We had things about companionship last week and how we should be companions and not competitors. And today we get to the real juicy stuff. Today, we get to secret affairs. Today we get to cover-ups. Today we get to lying and murder. It's going to be like an episode of Game of Thrones up in here. It's going to be amazing. I can't wait to dive into it with you. My prayer, though, isn't that you just have fun and have a good time with us as we go through the text this morning, but you'll be open to what God is going to speak to you through it as you listen and as you interact this morning, all right? Before I forget, and I will forget, so I'm going to throw it in here now, they just released a series on Amazon Prime, if you have that service, called David. It's a 9-episode series, I believe. It's a whole season of the life of David and the house of David. I've watched the first episode. So far, so good. So I'd encourage you, if you want to refresh what we've been over so far and a little more of the details that we haven't gone into, check that series out. It looks like it's done really well. So I'll encourage that. Now, today, we're going to jump right in to where our story. We're going to jump ahead a little bit from where we left off last week, though. We're going to go to 2 Samuel chapter 11. So if you're here with us this morning, or if you're online with us, open up a Bible or a Bible app. Jump in to the text with us. Don't just assume I'm reading the right stuff. Look it up. Find out for yourself. And be with us as we go through verses 1 and 2 just to get us started. We're going to go through a few more as we work ourselves along. And while you're turning to 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, and you're finding that, let me give you some context. Not just about what's going on in David's life at this point in his story, but also what's going on in the whole biblical story pointing up to this moment right here. As you're turning and as you're just listening in, maybe you're not familiar with this story, but the very first story that's ever told in the Bible is the story right after God creates everything. And in that, he creates humanity. And they're placed in this perfect garden paradise high on a mountaintop filled with beautiful trees that were all good for eating. And God created them and he trained them to live by his ways and to work and to play in his just amazingly very good world. It was just this amazing experience at the beginning. However, they quickly, if you know the story by this point, deviate from that plan by taking a fruit they're not allowed to eat, at least not yet, and they're going to have to now live outside the garden with some very literally deadly consequences at this point. We see that God doesn't abandon them, though, in that moment, right? He equips them. He calls them out. He charges them to multiply, to subdue the world around them. And in the meantime, he's going to raise up a Savior that will one day come and rescue them from the death and lead them back to the garden. That's that very first story. We talked about this in BBT last week for the few that were here to be able to be a part of that. How this story gets replicated over and over and over again in Scripture. If you don't know anything else about the Bible, I encourage you to read Genesis 1, chapters 1, 2, and 3. Reread it until you have it practically memorized, because you're going to see this story play out again and again and again. Each successive story in some way connects back to this first story. Matter of fact, you'll look later on, you'll see as people are looking for the Savior figure, you see figures rise up to lead them and how they ultimately fail. And one of those is Moses, right? He brings his people from slavery out of Egypt, brings them to a mountaintop experience. They hear from God, they get laws, which is not just a set of rules, but a standard of living that leads to life. And we probably know some of these. Maybe you remember some of these. We call them the 10 Commandments. Right? There's lots of great stuff in there. Like, do not murder. That's pretty good. We shouldn't murder, right? Right? Do not steal. And there's one at the end, at the very end, that says, do not covet. Covet, which is a word we don't use very much. Anybody use the word covet this week? I haven't used that word at all this week or the past year, really. But to covet means to desire for yourself other people's stuff, or sometimes other people themselves. Now, Moses dies in the wilderness. And over time, the people ask for a new king to lead them to uphold the law that they received on that mountain. And they get one king named Saul. We talked about him. He didn't turn out so well. Things kind of go downhill for him. But then God places David on the throne. And David gets off to a great start, right? He conquers giants. We talked about that in week 1. He is upholding the law. And during 2 Samuel in chapter 8, it even says that he subdues the land around him. The same exact word we hear God commanding the very first humans in Genesis. He's the ideal king. He's the ideal representative of the people to God. He's an intercessor in between God and man to protect the people, to defend them. And as he does so, the nation prospers because of his faithfulness. With that in mind, we need to see what's going to happen here in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. So let's read this together. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David, who is king, sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. And it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. Now, I got a little Bible nerd fun fact for you here. That word roof, the root Hebrew word, is the same as garden. They're one letter off, actually. So you have one letter off. So the writer is subtly sending us signals here to the first story. We have a human in a high garden who sees something very beautiful of seeing, which is the exact description of the tree of good and bad in the very first story. And so there's a decision to be made. That should cue us in. There's a decision happening in David's heart right here. It's a test. He sees a beautiful woman, sees something that's maybe his, maybe not. We're going to find out. Will he fail or pass the test that is given him? Will he pass or fail like his ancestors before him? We're going to see how that goes down in just a few minutes. Right now, we're going to take a break. And so if you look on the back table, I want to encourage you to sign up to bring something for Faith Family Sunday next week. That's on the Connect table. It's something green. You could bring cookies with green lettering on them. You could bring pistachio muffins. You could bring whatever you want. You could bring green eggs and ham for all I care. Just bring something green next week or something Irish theme. It's going to be amazing. I encourage you to chat with Elisa about Ignite before you get into break or as you're in break. I also encourage you to start a new life goal for March. So you'll see all those beautiful life goals on the door. We got another one coming because guess what? It's March, everybody. We went through February. We made it. Yay! Now we got March. So make sure that you're taking your February goal down. You're writing a new March goal. You're putting it on the sheet back there. And also, if you want to sign up for a group, we got group signups in the back. We got so much stuff for you to do. You're not going to have time enough to do it all. All right? But while you're trying to squeeze it all in the next few minutes, I got one question for you. It's so funny, John, that you said this is a wish list when you're looking at that, because the question this morning is, what's one thing on your wish list right now? And I don't mean like world peace or happiness or whatever, but what's one thing that you could obtain or spend more time on that you would love to do, but maybe you haven't had a chance to? All right, so think about one thing on your wish list. We'll get a 5-minute break. We'll come back and discuss it together. Let's do it. All right, as you have conversations going on, well, somebody with a microphone anywhere? Nobody's holding a microphone somewhere? Somebody's got one? Who? Oh, it's on the stage. I was like, who's holding it, Carrie? There's nobody holding this microphone. It physically exists up here, though. There you go. That's right. No, not yet. We haven't even got to it yet. We're getting there. Hold on. Just 2 seconds. All right. As you're getting back into the swing of things, I did fail to mention also, because there's so much happening here. Not only should you fill out a life goal, not only should you sign up for the stuff in the back, make sure you're doing all that. Also, this month in the cafe, we're supporting our local Girl Scouts. And so we have Girl Scout themed lattes in the cafe. And you can thank Erica for that. Where's Erica at? That was Erica's suggestion. All right, so you can have a Thin Mint, you can have a Samoa, you can have something else. I don't remember what we have in there. We got lots of other stuff. S'mores, right, you can have s'mores. Iced or pot, whichever you want. So lots of cool stuff in the cafe too. Highly encourage you to take part in that. And feel free, if you haven't been here or part of our church before, get up, move around. You don't have to sit here. Please do not feel like you're tied to this chair. If you feel like I'm going too long or you need to relieve yourself because you had too much of those Girl Scout cookie lattes, feel free to use the restroom at any time. I highly encourage that. All right, so let's talk about this question together. What's one thing on your wish list right now, something you could purchase or just spend more time doing? What's on your wish list? Anybody want to kick us off? Walt's got one for me. Thank you.
I want to go fishing.
There you go.
I
Not
haven't
ice
been
fishing?
fishing in years. I don't care. Ice fishing.
Whatever.
Pond fishing. I don't care. I just want to go fishing.
Awesome. Thank you. Great start. Going fishing. Dimitri's got one.
I just want to go and jump off the airplane, skydive.
Skydive?
Or bungee jump off the bridge, something, So, yeah.
Okay.
A little daredevil stuff.
I get, okay.
Dimitri, if God wanted you to fly, he'd give you wings. Just saying.
Anybody else? That's great. Good start. Come on, what's on your wish list? You all got something. Come on. Nobody's wishes for anything. You're just all happy, content people. All right, go ahead. Thank you, Maddie.
I just want to put together the nursery.
There you go. Great. Get your nursery ready. That's a good goal. That's something good on the wish list. Abby's got one for you.
I want to spend more time just doing recreational reading instead of the required reading with all the classes that I'm taking in college.
Yes. You'll get back to it eventually. Unless you have kids first, and then you won't get back to it.
I want the last 2 books in the book series that I have.
You ready for the end? Yeah, nice. It's always painful when they're not ready yet or when it's out or you can't get them. So irritating. His wife's already
He already has a
regretting.
jet ski, so he's good.
What else could you want?
I'm waiting for warmer weather to ride my motorcycle. It's my therapy,
Yes.
and I need it.
Amen. I'm with you. Connor's got one? You got one, Connor? No? Toby's pointing at you like you do. He's trying to get you.
So I want to be debt-free.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
I want to be out of school.
Yes.
Also, Dimitri, you might want to get a Red Bull. You can get wings that way, I hear. So.
See, it goes back to the wings, Dimitri.
Anybody else? Up here. Toby's got one.
I want to get into like rock climbing and hiking and stuff.
Yeah, nice. That's a great one. I love that. Kevin?
I just want to retire.
That's on the wish list. That's a good one. All right. Yeah, Chelsea, what you got?
I want summer break.
Summer break. Forget school ending. You want extended time off. Lots of time off. In warm weather. Anybody else? What's on your wish list, dream list? Want to do it, wish you could do it. Everybody else is perfectly content. All right, here we go. Marcel's got one.
My biggest wish is more communication with my 31-year-old son.
Yeah. Good luck with that. 31-year-old sons have a hard time communicating. As a 31-year-old son I used to be, I totally understand.
Want to become fluent in Spanish. I'm not fluent yet. I'm learning a lot.
Okay.
And then after that, I'd like to learn either Portuguese or French.
Nice. They're all Latin-based. It all ties together at some point. Learn Latin. Maybe you'll figure it out a lot easier. I don't know. All right. Anybody else? It's all great. Very cool. Oh, Leo's got one. There we go.
I want to take a cruise to the Mediterranean with Janine.
Yeah, nice. Mediterranean cruise. See Greece, see Italy. That'd be beautiful. Go swim in the Mediterranean. Anybody else? Perfect. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for sharing. I was having a hard time with this one this week. I don't know about you guys. Some of you are a little bit younger. maybe this is easier for you, but as I was thinking about this, I was having a hard time because I got kids, and they have wish lists, and they have birthdays, and they have Christmas coming up, and they're constantly adding or modifying lists in their life. Like, oh, I wanted this. They see the latest thing. They want to add it to their list. And my wife and I spend so much time on their wishes that I don't really think too much about my own. I don't know about her. She's a mom. She doesn't think about any. She thinks about everybody but herself. That's usually how moms work. But the more I thought about it, the more I kept thinking, it's like, if I had to list something down, and I asked you to, so I figured I had to. The more I kept thinking about it, I went back to a bigger travel budget. That would be my wish, top of my wish list. I love to explore. I love to see new things. And that's led our family to drive from here to Panama City Beach, and San Antonio, Texas was a great trip. And then went to Kansas City one year. We also went all the way out to Wyoming to Yellowstone, which was an amazing travel trip. It was long, and my wife and I said we wouldn't do it again, but now I'm getting the itch again that we may do a long trip again. And I've even got a picture. I've got a journal up on my somewhere. If we got a picture of it, we're going to throw it up here in a second. I've got a journal on it. I took with me on a sabbatical a couple years ago, and it says something to the effect of, if you can't read it, that I haven't been everywhere, but it's on my list, right? That's on my list. And so there's lots of places I'd love to visit, even just in the continental U.S., but if you don't know, it takes a lot of time, and here lately it takes a whole lot of money, right? It's a whole lot of money to go anywhere, even if you're driving places. And so I'd love to have a bigger travel budget. That would definitely be on the top of my wish list. And I think on some level we all have these things, whether it's to travel, whether it's to learn language, whether it's to go fishing, something as simple as that. They're wishes, they're dreams that are some are really big in our lives, right? Some seem impossible, and some are maybe even small. But whatever the case is, there's always something inherently that we want, or someone maybe that we want. And even when we're really content, maybe you're like that. Maybe you're like, I'm kind of good with whatever I got. I'm happy with where I'm at or what I have. But even when we're really content like that, there are times when we have a draw towards something that we see or we hear about others experiencing, and we just say, man, it'd be nice if I could, right? Now, God has made lots of beautiful things, lots of great, desirable things in this world. And I want to clarify something here, too, because I think God gets a bad rap a lot of times. We may think of God as this big, strict, cosmic dictator that's always kind of telling us what we can and can't do, right? And it's like, well, you can do this, but you can't do that, or you shouldn't have those feelings or those desires, and anything that you want is bad for you, whatever the case is. But God isn't anti-desire. He made beautiful fruit trees in the garden at the very beginning. He created every good thing to be desirable and gave it to the first humans to be consumed and used for enjoyment. In the case of our text today, he created the human body, both male and female, to be attractive and to be enjoyed in the proper context. He creates all these beautiful things. So the problem isn't desire. It isn't that you want something or that we desire after something. It's that our desire often gets distorted in us. And what we want, we tend to take at the expense of others and at the expense of God's plan for our lives. That battle, that giant battle for most of us on some level at some point you'll have in our lives is quite literally at the heart of who we are as humans. And it's what was raging here in David's heart that afternoon. As we think back to our text, he's looking out from his high garden. He sees this beautiful woman. So let's see how David fights this giant battle this morning. 1 and 2. I'm going to reread it. Get us back in the context here. It said, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab instead. And he sent his servants with him, and he sent all of Israel with him. And they ravaged the Ammonites. They were doing great. They were besieging Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. And it happened just late one afternoon. He's out hanging out on the roof. When he arises from his couch and he's walking around the roof of the king's house, and he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very, very, very beautiful, exceedingly beautiful. Now, from the very beginning, we have some red flags in this story. They should cue us in that something's going on, because up to this point, everything has been good. David has done so many good things for God and for his people. He's led them in the front at the battles. He's defended the weak and the helpless. He's been zealous for the God of Israel. But here something is shifting in David's life. Now, we don't know why he stayed and didn't go with the army. Maybe he decided just to take a campaign off, or maybe he wanted to give Joab, his commander, more experience leading, or maybe he was growing a little bit complacent in his life. His enemies are being subdued, the text tells us earlier. He's been fighting hard, and I'm sure he's thinking in his head, why not take a little break? right? I'm sure we've all done this. We haven't been fighting enemies. Literally, I don't think any of us have been doing that. But maybe you work a hard week or a hard month or a hard year, and you get to the end, it's like, man, I could use just a little bit of a break. And I think I deserve that, right? I've done all this work. Surely I deserve some time off. And I'm not disparaging time off. But we get in these mindsets where it's like, I need this. This is for me. So David decides, hey, I'm going to take a little bit of a break. And he stays home with his wives and his kids. Now, this day, he was particularly lazy, tired, whatever, laying around. And so it was in the afternoon. He'd been lounging around up on his roof, maybe enjoying the breeze. And he gets up and he walks around and he surveys the city. He surveys his city. He sees the people working. He sees the tradesmen selling their wares. He hears the marketplace buzzing. He sees the guards stationed at the gates. And everything is where it's supposed to be. Everything's in order. Everything is good in his sight. But then something else catches his eye. He sees this woman bathing. A good-looking one at that. Not just any woman, a good-looking woman. Now, before smartphones and internet access, there was outdoor bathing, guys. So if you needed something to do, instead of watching your phone, you happen to look out, oh, wow, there's somebody outside taking a bath in the river, or whatever the case is, or up on their roofs bathing, as it would have been in the city. And so David's looking and said, oh, wow, that's eye-catching. And then at that point, really nothing has gone wrong. He just needs to keep his eyes moving on, all right? He needs to keep scrolling. But he doesn't. The word saw there means lingered. In other words, he was enjoying the view, which is a problem. Now, David had multiple wives. He had multiple concubines, and as was his right as king in those days. So he didn't need someone else. He didn't need anyone else. And if he did, he could have gotten multiple women if he wanted to. But just like women in shoes or guys with guns, all you ever need is how many? One more, just one more, right? Just one more pair, just one more whatever, right? And for David, this is bad. But it's not horrible in the sense that maybe she's single, right? Maybe she's single. He just happens to catch her eye. Oh, that's nice. He's window shopping. He's like, oh, maybe I can just put a ring on that. I can fix that. I can bring her into the palace. So he sends a messenger out. He says, hey, go find out who that is. I need to know who this lady is. Verse 3 says this, and David sent and inquired about the woman. And the messenger came back and said, hey, this is Bathsheba, right? This is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Do you know who this is, David? He should know, because at this point, he's got an issue, right? David is a mighty king, right? He's got everything he wants. He's got everything he possibly could have. And he should have at that moment, as soon as he heard about the woman, he said, that's Bathsheba, not only the daughter of Eliam, which you might remember him, David, but you know Uriah, and you know that he and her are married. So he's looking at a married woman. And what's more, he's looking at a woman who's married to what happens to be one of David's best warriors. Later on in 2 Samuel, it lists David's mighty men, the men who were renowned in battle, who's proved their loyalty and strength on the battlefield time and time again for Israel and for Israel's king, for King David. They were the mightiest of the men on the field. And Uriah is one of those mighty men. Now, at this point, David could have just said, wow, great for Uriah. I didn't know that he bagged that. I didn't know he had married above his level like that. So he could have just said, you know what? That's great. Good for him. I'm going to make sure I give him a good slap on the back and say, man, how'd you pull that off, Uriah, when he comes back from the field, right? He could have done that. So let's see what he do. Verse 4. It says, so David sent messengers, and he took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. And he gives a little parentheses here. He says, now she had been purifying herself for uncleanness, and then she returned to her house. A couple of key things going on here. Just in the Hebrew itself, you have the word took. He took her. The Hebrew word for take here is the same that's used in Genesis where humans take the one fruit that they're not supposed to have. So here in a high garden, in a place of testing, David could have looked away and not given in to his desire, but instead he takes for himself and repeats that same mistake that we see happening at the very beginning. The man who is supposed to have a heart after God's heart is choosing his will over God's. Coveting, adultery, lying. In our lives, these things are pretty commonplace. We might not, again, use the word covet But we do this all the time. We see it happen all the time. Maybe not in our lives, but we hear stories of it happening in lives all over. And we know that these things are bad. We know these things are wrong on some level. We see the effects of them in our family life. We may even go to court over these things, but rarely do we think of something that's going on in the background. Rarely do we think of the spiritual implications that are going on around us when we're making these decisions like David is making here. We may think we're in our room on our phone, just scrolling along. But in reality, we're next to a tree with really good-looking fruit. Do we see it? Do we desire it? And do we take it for ourselves? Or do we put down the phone and pursue God's will and wisdom over our own? Now, maybe it's not a desire for another person. Maybe you're not scrolling and you're seeing pictures of women or men or whatever the case is. Maybe you're seeing pictures of a new jet ski or a new motorcycle or a new fishing rod or whatever the case is, right? And we're flipping along. Maybe it's a desire for something else. Maybe it's pictures of Utah and you're like, oh, I love to go to Utah. And you want to see, and you see these people driving through these beautiful canyons. You're like, oh, I really want to do that. There's something you want to take. Something's happening in you when you're scrolling through or when you're watching the driveways of those around you or when you're seeing and hearing stories of people coming back from places like Florida and how the beautiful weather is 80 degrees and how nice was that? And you're like, man, yeah, that would be nice. And so you're thinking about all this stuff, and even something for someone we love, even if it's something that's not bad, can be, in some cases, a misplaced desire when we choose to allow it to push us into bad decisions. The command for us not to covet understands something implicit, that there is an act happening in the heart. Before we do anything out here, something is stirring in here. See, before David took Bathsheba physically, he took her in his head and in his heart. And I'm sure as he's following through on that desire, he's thinking what we all think when we make rash decisions or bad decisions. In his case, it would have been something like, it's just a one-night stand. Just one time. And who's it really going to hurt? Nobody's going to know anyway, right? Who's going to find out? But he wasn't thinking enough, because we're going to find here every trouble for the rest of his life is going to tie back to this one moment. Misplaced desire in sin has consequences, whether we see them in the moment or not. But in the moment, everything's good, right? So David, in his moment, everything's great. He gets what he wants. The messengers bring the beautiful Bathsheba into the house. He gets what he wants. Nobody gets hurt. He probably doesn't think too much of it. One time, she's back home. Everything's great. Spring continues to go. Battles continue to rage far away from David, but he's content where he's at. The weather continues to turn and turns even beautiful, and he gets more good news, and then he gets some other news. It says 2 words. 2 words David gets. These 2 words can bring so much joy and so much dread. These 2 words are, I'm pregnant. I'm pregnant. So now what? David gets the words back. Bathsheba says, hey, David, guess what? Surprise. I'm pregnant. Now what? Now, I'm sure David's mind at that point is racing, right? I'm sure he's thinking about, oh, shoot, right? All that previous confidence, all that bravado he had is now just going completely down the drain, because David not only has his status, he has his reputation to think of. He's the beloved king. He's the giant slayer. He's the friend of God and Israel. But what would happen if the people who love him so much now found out about this? It's against the law in Israel for anybody to do what David did, but it's so much more egregious that the king, the one who's supposed to uphold the whole law, is now the one breaking that very law. He's supposed to protect the people, lead his men into battle, and not steal their wives behind their back while they're fighting on the front line. Now, in our time, these scandals happen all the time, right? I'm rarely ever shocked by anything anymore. Anything. As a matter of fact, I find it more shocking when you find out that someone's been faithfully married for like 50 years. I'm like, wow, that's amazing, right? Who does that anymore? But in Israel, this would have been scandalous, especially for a king like David, because he's the chosen one. And he's the one who's been doing so good for so long. So as David's mind races, he comes to this conclusion. There's got to be a way to fix this. Now, he can't go back, can't change time, and he could come clean, but he doesn't want to face that music right now. So instead, he does what everybody does when they screw up. They cover it up. So he's in cover-up mode. Now, at this point, this may sound familiar. Adam and Eve and their moment covered their shame in fig leaves before God shows up. Saul plots to kill David in the weeks leading in his early life. We read that last week and the week before by moving him to the front lines of battle. But now David is on the other side of this conspiracy. Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, he's out on the front lines. He's leading men into battle. And David loves Uriah. Uriah is one of his mighty men. He loves Uriah, but he loves himself more. So instead of hoping Uriah will just die on the field, maybe he'll just die, that'd be great. He says, well, I got to hedge my bets. I got to make sure we're taken care of here. So let me call him home, right? Every soldier needs a break every now and then. And if he happens to go home, maybe he'll go home and go all the way to his house and enjoy time with his wife while he's back. And if that's the case, great. All the better. For all anyone else would know, the child's going to be Uriah's. David's off the hook. Everything's great. So David calls him back to the palace. He sends a message to the front. He says, hey, I need Uriah back here. Send him back. Let's talk about how the war is going. So he sends him back. He showers them with gifts. He gives them great kingly favor. And they also share some more stories and go back and forth for a while. And then he sends them home. He says, hey, man, go home. Go home to your wife. Enjoy your time while you're back before you have to go back to the fightings. And as he sends Uriah away, David goes to bed. He lays himself in his bed, and I'm sure he's sleeping soundly that night. He's thinking, got that done. That's like, I'm so smart, right? All right, a wise king. I got this figured out. So he sends him, he goes to sleep soundly, but when he wakes up and goes into the courtyard, he finds Uriah hasn't gone anywhere. He stayed outside in the courtyard, and he slept with his servants instead, right? What type of guy does this, right? Who gets called back from the front, has the opportunity to go back to her own, apparently a very beautiful wife who hasn't seen her for weeks at this point, and comes back home and doesn't go home, but instead sleeps outside with the servants and the animals. So David asks, he says, hey, why didn't you go home last night? What are you doing? Who are you, right? And Uriah replies with this. It's verse 11 of 2 Samuel chapter 11. Uriah says to David, the ark in Israel and Judah dwell in booths. They're out in tents. But my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Everybody's out. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. Now, one, Uriah is an exceptional human, exceptional man, exceptional warrior. And Uriah wouldn't have known this. Maybe he did. Maybe he intended backhand. I don't know. But this would have been a slap in David's face. Because what he essentially is saying is everyone is where they're supposed to be. Everybody's where they're supposed to be. God's presence is with the ark on the front, fighting the enemy. Joab, the commander, is out there fighting the enemy. The men are fighting the enemy, and everybody's doing their part. They're sleeping outside because that's what you do when you're on the battlefield. They're taking their time and energy, and everything they are is where they're supposed to be. And even if I'm back, Uriah is saying, even if I'm back in this comfort and this luxury and not out there on the front, I still am not going to allow myself to indulge when they can't indulge in what I have. If they can't do it, I'm not going to do it. And he's saying all this, all the while, King David, who's led from the front so many times, is now sleeping in his bed with his nice sheets, with his wives at his side, soundly like a baby every single night. Uriah was an exceptional man. He says, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go back. So David gets desperate. David says, oh, shoot, that didn't plan A didn't work. Plan B, what can I do now? What can I do now? What can I do now? All right, so let me think. All right, Uriah, come back. You're already hanging out. Let's come back to the palace. We're going to have a big feast tonight. We're going to have a dinner, and we're going to get the best wine served. Come and hang out. So Uriah comes back as the faithful servant of the king. He gets served the best wine, and David gets Uriah just sloshed enough so he could walk back home to his wife and have a good time with her when he gets there. That's the plan. Not a bad plan. Not a bad plan, right? So David goes to bed again. David sleeps soundly, thinking everything's good. Then David wakes up, he goes outside, and guess who's there? Y'all can talk out loud. Guess who's there? Uriah. Thank you. Right. Okay, thank you. Perfect. Yeah. Uriah's outside. He's back out there again. Even inebriated, this guy does the right thing. Who is this man, right? This guy is just incredible. Now, at this point, David could have just given up. He should have just given up. He could have stopped the plotting. He could have confessed his crime. He could have suffered the consequences, but now he's in way too deep. You ever been there, guys and gals? You ever been there? Feel like you've made a bad decision, and now you can't come back and fix it because you've doubled down, and now you got to double down again, right? You got to keep the cover up going because it's way too late. Because now even the cover up is worse than what you started with. He's in way too deep. His pride has led him to this deception, and now he's trapped in it, and he doesn't have any way out, at least that he sees or that he's willing to take. He's got to maintain his good name, which at this point, if Uriah's not going to sleep with Bathsheba, and that solves that issue, that means he's got to marry Bathsheba. But by law, he can't take another man's wife. He can take any single woman he wants, just not another man's, which means Uriah has to go. Now, it's easy, I think, to see the downward spiral of misplaced desire in somebody else's life. And we see it here in David's pretty easily. We see David's eyes linger. We see his heart want what isn't his. We see his desire acting it out by taking it anyway. We see the lie he has to tell to cover it up. And now, even worse, he starts to move to plan C. He sends a letter back with Uriah to Joab on the front lines, and in it he says, Joab, send Uriah to the front of the battle, the very thickest of the fighting, against the very walls of the city. When the enemy engages, you pull everything back and leave Uriah there, so we know for sure he's going to be killed. But the enemy's going to kill him. Since David can't do it, let the enemy do it. So Joab gets the message, but Joab doesn't want to be known as someone who commits premeditated murder against one of his men. He's not a great guy, Joab, but he doesn't want to do that, so he does something even worse. He sends Uriah's whole unit to the walls of the city and doesn't pull anybody back. They all get slaughtered at the front. And he sends a messenger back to David after the battle. He says, hey, your problem, got that for you, king. You're good. Now, at home, David gets that message. He acts as everything is normal. Word comes back to the city of the loss of not just Uriah, the whole unit, all the men at the battlefield that day that died, and many families are going to spend the next few days making funeral preparations and mourning the loss of the sons, of their husbands, of their dads, and of their uncles. And among them is Bathsheba and her family. So David waits it out. Few days, few weeks as the funeral preparations are made, mourning is happening, and after a suitable time, David seems to do a very honorable thing in the sight of others around him. He takes Bathsheba home. He takes his widow now into his home, under his care, under his protection. I can imagine the gossip around town being fairly positive. I can imagine people saying, oh man, isn't that great that King David cares so much for one of his mighty men that he's taking care of his family like that. That he brings his very wife into his house. And did you hear the news? It's even better than that. They're going to have a baby together. Oh, what such a blessing that will be to take her mind off of the loss of her husband. Isn't King David amazing? And in David's eyes and in the lives of so many people around him, he'd pulled it off. He did it. He did it. He committed an amazing crime and covered it up in an amazing way. He got away with it. He'd coveted another man's wife, even got her pregnant and covered the whole thing up with nobody being the wiser. I mean, who says you can't have your cake and eat it too? This guy did it, right? So everybody gets a lesson here, right? Do whatever you want. Just be really good at covering up. That's all you got to do. Great, let's pray. You ready? Okay. Almost there. There's just one hiccup. It's in verse 27, the last part of verse 27. But the thing that David had done displeased who? Displeased the Lord. Nobody knew, as far as David knew. Maybe a few of the servants around, they saw something going on, but nobody really knew. But the Lord knew. And what he had done displeased the Lord. He's thinking, what thing? What thing? What one thing did David? All the things up to this point were displeasing to the Lord. Now here we go in this part. This is the best. Love this part of the story. Months now pass. Everything is going great on the surface. Everybody's going along. Everything is wonderful. Palace is moving along. Fighting's going great. Everything's wonderful. Behind the scenes, David's struggling. Guilt follows him wherever he goes. He's still king. Everybody still loves him. Amazing guy. But he was broken on the inside. He had fallen low from where he had been. A heart that had been after God's own was now stained with guilt and stained with death. Not just of one man, but of a whole unit of people. Whole families affected. What David needed, what he desired now more than any woman, was forgiveness and for restoration. But here's the thing with forgiveness and restoration. To get to those points, you have to go through something painful. You had to go through conviction. Enter stage left a man called Nathan. Nathan was a prophet, appointed by God to speak God's truth to the king, even when the king didn't want to hear it. So far, his job had been pretty easy. David did what he was supposed to, but today he has a hard task. Nathan hadn't seen what David had done, but he had heard it, not from gossip, but from God. God told him David's dirty little secret. And now Nathan comes into the court to call him to account. What I love about this part of the story, what I love about Nathan in this section, is his approach. This wouldn't work on everybody, but Nathan knew that David had a strong sense of justice. Strong sense of justice. So instead of just outright accusing David and putting him on the defensive, because you know, guys, I can't speak for ladies, but you know, guys, as soon as your wife or spouse or anybody in your life says you're supposed to do something you didn't do it, or you did something you didn't do it, immediately you're like defending yourself, right? You're not just thinking of like, oh yeah, thanks for correcting me. No, you're going to fight back, right? You're like, no, I did this thing. I took the trash out. I didn't talk to her. I wasn't looking at that lady, right? I know we're at the beach. Everybody's wearing nothing. I get it. My shades were on. I was looking down my book, right? Whatever the case is. I didn't do that. We're going to defend ourselves. Nathan didn't go up and say, I knew what you did in the spring. David would have been like, I don't know what you're talking about, Nathan. That baby's your eyes. I don't know, right? Right? So he'd been saying all that. But no, so Nathan does something different. Nathan tells a story. He tells a story. Stories are so powerful. That's why I love doing stories like this. He tells a story and lets God deal with David's heart through it. So let's read it together. I don't even want to summarize it. I want to read it. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. It says, And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him, and he said to him this. So good. There were two men in a certain city, one rich, the other poor. And the rich man had very many flocks and herds, lots of sheep. But the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he had brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. And he used to eat of his very own morsel and drink from his very own cup. And it would lie in his arms at night. It was like a daughter to him, this little lamb. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, the neighbor. And he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or one of his own herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him as what you're supposed to do. But instead, he saw his poor neighbor, and he took the poor man's lamb from the poor man and used it and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Now to David, this isn't just a story. All right, we read it, got it, it's a story. We're thinking in our heads. To David, it wasn't a story. As far as he knew, this was a case to be judged as king. Okay? So he's thinking Nathan's bringing him something he's got to decide on. He's got to fix this, right? Because as he listened to this, I'm sure he's thinking about a whole host of things. One of them would have been his own life. One of them, I'm sure he's recalling his time as a young man on the hillsides with his sheep. And he remembers his poor family, how his father's flocks were so small, they were just enough to keep his family fed and cared for, and how he would play with those sheep, and how he loved those sheep. He would defend them against wild animals. He would sleep overnight with them in his arms. He would do everything he could to make sure they were safe. They were more than livestock to David. They were like family to him. And so I'm sure he's thinking back to his childhood and remembering those precious sheep he had in his care. And I'm sure he's thinking, man, if someone came and did that to me, my family, what would I do? How would I react? That's one thing he's thinking of. He's also thinking about himself. And so he hears this rich man, here's how this rich man is taking this poor neighbor's things, and he is furious. He erupts at that moment with uncharacteristic anger. It just erupts here. It's verses 5 and 6. It said, then David's anger was greatly kindled. I appreciate the subtle nature of the text. He was furious, right, against the man in the story, against the rich man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold. You got to give him back 4 more lambs because he has done this thing. And I love the last line. And because he had no pity, no compassion, he just took what he wanted. Oh, how quick we are to pass judgment on others, but not ourselves. David doesn't realize it yet, but in telling this story, Nathan has just held up a mirror in front of David. The man he condemns is himself. But Nathan doesn't want to leave it up to chance. So to make sure he doesn't miss it, the text says this. You are the man. You are that man. You're the one who took this one little lamb that Uriah had. You who had it all have taken what isn't yours just because you could. So Nathan, after making sure that David was aware that he has been found out for sure now, passes judgment. But before and as, rather, he passes judgment, he tells of God's heart in this judgment. It's verses 7b and 8. Nathan says this. He says, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you, David, king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. God had poured out grace and blessing over David's life. All he had was from the grace of God. David was nothing before God showed up. God had prepared him and placed him, and he was prepared to give him even more. He said, how much more I would give you if you would have just asked. God says, why? Why did you do it? Why did you throw it all away for a moment of pleasure? Why weren't you content with what I had given you? If you had wanted something, all you had to do was ask. See, what God promises, he fulfills. He gives life, and he gives it abundantly. And yet we wrestle with a desire to take what we don't need instead of asking for what we do. And in those moments, what we need most is restoration. But to receive that, we have to go through conviction. You have to understand that the seriousness of misplaced desire, the seriousness of what our taking has on others, the consequences that's played out, not just in our own lives, but for everyone else's. And God has to bring us to that point so that we can admit our guilt before God and before the others that we have hurt in this process. We have to be brought to the point of being sorrowful and not just sorry. There's a difference. My kids do it all the time. They hurt their siblings. I say, you need to ask forgiveness. And they'll go up to them and they'll say, I'm sorry. I said, that's not what I asked you to do. I didn't tell you to go say you're sorry. I said, you're going to go back. You're going to be sorrowful for what you did, and you're going to apologize, and you're going to ask them to give you forgiveness. You don't deserve it, but I'm going to ask you for them to give it to you. It's not about being sorry. It's about being sorrowful. The consequences of David's actions, God's judgment that God gave, would be that the sword which he had used to conquer David's enemies would now be turned in on him and on his family. 3 of David's sons would die before David did. And another one would be killed immediately after for trying to usurp the throne. But in that moment, I believe when David heard that verdict that he had been avoiding for so long, I'm sure he expected his own death. It's what he deserved. It's what the law would have required for his murder of Uriah and all his other men. It's what David had said the rich man in the story deserved. And so when David hears the judgment, he isn't so bold as to ask for forgiveness or even for restoration. He simply says in verse 13, I have sinned against the Lord. I'm guilty. When confronted with conviction, the only proper response is confession. Finally, instead of trying to save his reputation or deny he was in the wrong, he finally confronts the problem himself. So surely he's going to get what he deserves. Let's find out. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. Unlooked for mercy. David didn't expect this. There was no expectation of pardon. But I know, we're going to read in a sec, I know that in that moment, when he heard those words from Nathan, from God, he felt that flood of forgiveness wash over him that he knew he didn't deserve. There were consequences to his sin. Others would suffer. He would suffer those consequences, but death that was deserved for him, he would not receive. Not then. Reflecting back on this moment, he would later write this song. It's in Psalms. It's verse 32. He said, blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. He says, for when I kept silent, when I tried to cover it up, my bones were wasting away through my groaning all day long. He was tearing them up inside. Verse 5 says, yet I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I'll confess my transgressions to the Lord. And the most beautiful part of all says, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. So David encourages everybody else. He says, therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer to you at a time when you may be found. Surely in the rush of great waters, when everything's raging around us, when we call out on God, confessing our need for him, surely even in the midst of great waters, they shall not reach him. You won't be overwhelmed or overcome. In the place of death, David received life. David, the chosen one with a calling, the man of combat who slayed that giant, the faithful companion and friend of men and God, was still just a man. He was still a flawed man who failed that same test we all face and we all fail at some point. David, and our only hope, is that there is another that is greater than us. Another that will not fail the test. Another that won't just fight and win battles, but who covers our greatest failures with forgiveness. When we place our lives in the hand of him, in the hands of the way, the truth, the life, and the resurrection, in the hands of Jesus, he who was perfect, he who did not fail, he who passed the test and paid our price that we deserve. When we place our life in his hands, not expecting mercy, just saying, I'm guilty. What comes back every single time isn't what we deserve, but grace instead. And while we, like David, have to live with the consequences of those failures, We can take solace in the fact that God can redeem even those into a future that we could never create for ourselves. His grace is that big. His mercy that great. His love that incomprehensible. And so today, maybe you're here and you need to say, as David did, I'm guilty. Guess what? We all have to say that. There's not one person here, there's not one person who could step through these doors, never will be, who can say, I'm not guilty. We might not have taken another man's wife, we may not have murdered hundreds of men, but we've all done something. And we've all been in the process of covering it up. How we dress when we come in here on a Sunday morning. How we talk to people when we're out in town. We'll confess certain things, but we won't confess everything. We'll admit to our guilt in some areas, but other guilt, we're like, I don't know, nobody's going to know. I'm never going to let anybody know that. I'm going to bury that one. But God knows. And an amazing thing is that God doesn't look at that and say, you're done. He says you're forgiven through the blood of Jesus. He died in your place. I'm going to give you grace instead. And not just give you a way out, but give you a way in, back to the garden, back to where you belong, back to me. And so maybe you're here today and you are ready to receive that gift. We're going to give you a chance to do that in just a minute. But maybe you're here as a church. Maybe you're as believers and you've been through that process. Guess what? You're going to have to go through it again. Not that you need salvation over and over again, but you need sanctification, because we all do. We need a process where day by day we come back to him and we say, Lord, at the end of the day, when we get to the very end of it, and we look back at all the good things we've done, we can look back and say, well, I didn't do that right, though. And I could have done that a little better. And it's not about feeling guilty or looking down on ourselves or making us feel worthless. It's about recognizing the reality that we live in is that we're far from perfect. And the only way to go anywhere close to what God is calling us to is by confessing that guilt and relying on him, not just one time, forever and all time, but every single day of our lives. And saying, I don't deserve grace, but I need it. Let's pray this morning. So if you're here and you're ready to say yes to Jesus, is how we phrase this. In other words, to respond to Christ's call on your life. As the worship team is making their way up here, I want to encourage you to respond to that. It's not just about thinking it in your head. Confession is something that has to happen out loud. Now, I don't mean you have to come and confess it to me. Jesus is the great high priest. I'm not your priest. But God requires you to confess it. He brings us to the point of conviction, to the point where we have to say, I'm guilty. So maybe that's you this morning. And maybe when you come to that, you say, I need that grace and forgiveness. How you come to that confession is by coming and saying words like these. It's prayer. It's coming back up to God and reflecting back to him and saying, Lord, I'm not just sorry. I'm guilty. And I'm not just sorry for what I've done. I'm sorrowful for what I've done. And God, today as I'm listening in, as I'm hearing the story of David's life, as I'm hearing, God, the life he lived and went through, and the cover-up he went over, and the conviction he experienced, that God, today, that's me. God, I need you. I don't just want you. I need you. The only way forward in my life is to and through you. God, I ask for your forgiveness, though I don't deserve it. God, I'm calling out, God, to you, Lord, who gives mercy and grace undeserved and pours it out on us through the blood of Jesus. God, today I choose you and not me and my desires. Now, if that's you and you prayed that prayer, I want to encourage you before you leave here today, find me. Find John, find Walt in the back, find Carrie, find someone in this room before you leave. Don't leave this space. Don't leave us online before you say, I said yes to Jesus today. I've committed my life to him to move forward with him and away from who I am and what I want to what he wants for my life. Help us, Jesus, today. to face the conviction with confession.